It's 1936 on Slipway 9 at Blohm Voss in Hamburg. Deep inside the hull, in the cramped dark of the double bottom, a welder strikes an arc. The steel flares white. Then another arc and another, hour after hour, plate fused to plate by hand. The launch and the guns come later. This is the work almost no one remembers. The hull rising above them will weigh more than 50,000 tons, and it's being welded together by hand instead of riveted, a new and dangerous craft at this scale. And the danger is the whole point of it. This deadly, unglamorous labor is the only way a hull that big can be willed into existence. The men doing it were never named. The ship they were building would fight for 9 days. Not the admirals who feared her, not the designers who drew her, the men who welded her. This is the story of how the Bismarck was built. The yard, the deadly work, the launch, and the machinery at her heart, and the 9 days at sea it was all for. Blohm and Voss had been building ships on the Elbe in Hamburg for more than half a century. Cargo liners, passenger steamers, warships for the Kaiser. The yard knew how to put steel on the water, but nothing it had ever laid down matched what began to take shape on Slipway 9 in the summer of 1936. The keel went down on the 1st of July, 1936. In the yard's own record, she wasn't yet the Bismarck. She was construction number BV509, laid on the slipway the Germans called Helgen 9. She would become the last capital ship Blohm and Voss ever launched. When she finally slid into the water, an era slid with her, and the yard never built her equal again. A hull this size didn't simply need men, it needed a place built to hold it. The slipway rose under a lattice of scaffolding that towered over the Hamburg waterfront, a cliff of timber and steel taller than the buildings around it, high enough that a man working near the top looked down on the whole yard below and the river beyond. Beside it stood the yard's heavy lift docks, among the most powerful in the world, engineered to raise tens of thousands of tons a ship clear of the water. This was fixed infrastructure, poured and bolted into the riverbank years earlier, standing ready for a hull big enough to justify it. The Bismarck was that hull, and she was enormous. Finished, she measured 251 meters from bow to stern and 36 meters across the beam. On the design drawing, she displays 41,700 tons standard. Loaded for war, fueled and stored and crewed, that figure swelled to 50,300 tons. On paper, almost none of this was allowed. Bismarck was built under the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which capped a battleship at 35,000 tons. She was thousands of tons over that ceiling before she ever fired a shell. The number written on the treaty and the number rising on the slipway were not the same number, and every man who signed the drawings knew it. The problem the yard faced was simple to state and brutal to solve. How do you build something that heavy, then armor it, then still drive it fast enough to matter without the weight of the hull itself eating the whole ship alive? The answer changed the way she was put together, plate by plate, from the keel up. For as long as steel ships had existed, they were riveted. Plates were overlapped, holes were punched, and red-hot rivets were driven through by hand and hammered flat, hundreds of thousands of them on a warship, sometimes millions on a single great hull. Rivets are heavy. The overlaps that carry them are heavier. Every riveted seam carries metal whose only job is to hold two plates together, dead weight repeated across the entire skin of the ship. Bismarck's hull was built roughly 90% welded instead. Welding doesn't join two plates. It fuses them, melting the edges until they run together and cool as one continuous piece of steel. No overlap, no rivet heads, the seam itself becoming part of the plate. It was a radical choice at this scale. Welding was still a young craft in a naval yard, half-proven, hard on the men who did it, and no one had ever welded a capital ship this large. A bad rivet is one weak point among a million. A bad weld can run, invisible, along a seam. The yard was betting the strength of the largest warship in Europe on a technique the world was still learning. But it saved weight, tons of it, the weight that riveting would have thrown away on its own hardware. What welding gave back, it gave back to the ship. That fused steel was worked into a structure meant to be almost impossible to kill. A double bottom, two complete layers of hull with a protective void running between them, extended along 83% of the ship's length, so a torpedo or a mine that tore open the outer skin would still meet a second wall of steel before it reached anything that mattered. Above that, the hull was divided into 22 watertight compartments, sealed steel cells, each built to flood on its own without dragging its neighbors down. Damage was meant to stay where it happened, contained, isolated, survivable. Years later, in the cold of the North Atlantic, that welded compartmentation would keep her afloat and firing long after the men hunting her expected her to be on the bottom. And onto that welded frame went the armor. Not plating in the ordinary sense, but some of the hardest steel Germany could produce, from the Krupp works that had been armoring German warships for generations. The belt along her waterline, the faces of her gun turrets, the barbettes that carried them, and the conning tower where her officers would fight the ship were cut from Krupp Cemented steel, KCNA, face hardened so the outer surface was glass hard to shatter an incoming shell, while the steel behind it stayed tough enough that the whole plate didn't crack apart. The armored decks, laid flat to stop plunging shell fire and bombs falling from above, used a different Krupp steel called Wotan Hard, tough the whole way through rather than hardened at the face. The thicknesses were staggering. The main belt ran 320 millimeters, close to a third of a meter of hardened steel wrapped around her engines and magazines. The faces of her main turrets were thicker still at 360 millimeters. The armored decks ran between 100 and 120 millimeters of solid steel overhead. This was a ship designed to stand in the open, take hits from another battleship's guns, and keep shooting. The protection alone weighed more than many warships displaced in total, an entire ship's worth of steel devoted to nothing but staying alive under fire. And here's where the work down in the dark quietly decided everything, though no one watching the welding arcs flare in the double bottom would have said so out loud. Every ton the welders saved by fusing the hull instead of riveting, it was a ton the designers were free to spend somewhere else, on thicker belt armor, on heavier turret faces, on more fuel and more shells, and a longer reach across the ocean. The unglamorous labor happening deep inside the Leviathan was buying her the very things that would make the Royal Navy fear her: the armor that could shrug off a heavy shell, the weight budget for guns that could destroy a warship in minutes. The welded hull did more than save cost and weight. It was the hidden foundation the whole feared silhouette stood on, but that steel did not weld itself. Every meter of those seams, every joint in the double bottom, every fused plate along 251 meters of hull was laid down by a man with a torch, by hand, in the cramped dark, one arc at a time. The hull was rising above the Hamburg waterfront month after month exactly as designed. What it cost the men who raised it, the ones the histories never bothered to record, is where this story turns next. What it cost the men who raised her began with the space they worked in. A battleship's double bottom is a honeycomb of sealed steel cells, some of them barely large enough for a man to fold himself into, buried between the two skins of the hull with the weight of the whole ship pressing down from above. This was where the most punishing welding on the Bismarck was done. Not out in the open air of the Slipway, where the great plates were craned into place, but deep inside her in compartments a man had to crawl into and couldn't stand up in, joining her inner structure one seam at a time. There was no daylight down there. The only steady light was the arc itself, a point of flame hot enough to melt steel, burning inches from the welder's face. Look at it directly, without the dark glass of a hood, and it scorches the surface of the eye. Welders knew the injury as arc eye, a burn to the cornea that a man often didn't feel until hours later, in the dark when it felt as though his eyes had been packed with sand. And in a hull where arcs flared at every level and every hour, a man didn't have to be the one holding the torch to catch it. A flash reflected off a bulkhead caught from the corner of the eye was enough. Then there was the air. Welding doesn't burn clean. It boils metal and the metal comes off as fume, a fine smoke of vaporized steel and whatever coated it hanging in the space where it's made. Out on an open deck, it drifts away on the river wind. Sealed inside a double-bottom cell with no wind and nowhere to rise, it had nowhere to go but into the lungs of the man making it. He breathed his own work hour after hour in a pocket of steel with barely room to turn around. And everywhere around that work waited the thing a welder fears most: fire. A capital ship under construction is full of timber. It's floored and braced and threaded with wooden staging and walkways and scaffolding, running through every level so the men can reach the work. It holds drums of fuel and oil and paint and the rags and grease that go with them. Into that, welding throws sparks and molten spatter and heats steel on one side of a bulkhead hot enough to set alight whatever leans against the other side, unseen. A fire that started deep in a hull, in a maze of compartments reachable only by crawling, with one way in and the same way out, didn't need to be large to be fatal. The steel itself was a hazard long before it was armor. The plates that made her weren't the thin sheets of a car body. Krupp armor came in slabs weighing tons apiece, and they had to be moved, lifted off the ground by crane and chain, swung through the air over the heads of the men below, and eased into place by hand against the curve of the hull. A plate that size doesn't forgive a snapped chain, a fouled hook, a misjudged swing. It doesn't need to fall far. Men worked beneath suspended tonnage every day the hull rose, steadying loads they could never have stopped, trusting the rigging and the crane driver and their own footing on wet steel and greased timber. None of this was an accident of the work. It was the work. The choice that made the Bismarck possible, fusing her hull by hand instead of riveting it, was the same choice that put men in those cells breathing fume and staring into the arc. The danger and the ship were the same thing. A hull that large, carrying that much armor, couldn't be built any other way. And there was no version of building it that didn't send men down into the dark with a torch. Everything the world would come to fear about her was paid for here, up front, in a currency the histories rarely bother to count. The deadliest job in the yard was also the one job without which there was no launch and no ship at all. And here an honest account has to stop and say plainly what it doesn't know. We'd like to give these men a number, to tell you how many worked on her, how many were maimed, how many died raising the warship the whole Royal Navy would come to fear. The accessible record doesn't preserve it. No confirmed death toll for the building of the Bismarck survives where it can be checked. No reliable count of the injured, not even a single man named with a date beside him. That silence isn't proof that no one died. On a job this large and this dangerous, stretched over nearly 4 years, in an age that weighed a worker's life against a warship's schedule and didn't always choose the worker, it would be remarkable if the yard buried no one. But this account won't hand you a figure it can't stand behind. Inventing a casualty count to make the danger land harder would be a lie, and the danger doesn't need it. The danger here was never a number somebody made up. It's written into the method itself, into every seam that had to be laid by hand in a place a man could barely fit. What the record does show is the shape of the labor. It was anonymous. The men who welded her weren't the admirals who would fear her or the designers whose names sit on the drawings. They were tradesmen and laborers who came to the Elbe before first light, climbed into the hull, did work that would kill them if they did it wrong, and were replaced the next shift by men doing the same. The pace never eased. She was a warship for a rearming Germany, built to a schedule that didn't bend for weather or for exhaustion, and the yard around them accepted a level of risk that would shut it down today. A man was expected to look after himself, to know that the arc blinds and the fume chokes and the plate doesn't stop, and to climb back in and keep working. Season after season the work went on, seam by seam, plate by plate, the hull climbing higher over the Hamburg waterfront until the shape of a finished battleship stood on the Slipway, held there by the ways and the blocks and the sheer stubbornness of the yard. And then came the day the whole city had been waiting for, the day the yard would stop holding her up and let her go, and the hull would meet the water at last. The day came on the 14th of February, 1939. For nearly 3 years she had stood on Slipway 9, growing seam by seam on the ways, held up by the blocks and the yard's own stubbornness. Now the yard had come to let her go. The banks of the Elbe filled with people, an enormous crowd drawn to the water to watch the largest thing Blohm Voss had ever tried to set afloat leave the land at last. Flags hung from the scaffolding. The hull stood above them all, still raw, still unpainted in places, but unmistakably a battleship in shape. Adolf Hitler had come to Hamburg for it. He spoke for the better part of a quarter of an hour in front of the towering stern to the crowd and the cameras and the men of the yard drawn up below. And then a single woman stepped forward to do the one thing that would give the ship her name. Dorothea von Lohenfeld, granddaughter of Otto von Bismarck himself, the chancellor the ship was built to honor, took her place at the bow. She named the hull for her grandfather and broke the bottle against the steel. At 34 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, the last of the shores were knocked away. For a moment nothing moved. Then the whole hand-welded hull began to slide slowly, then faster, stern first down the greased ways, and the most feared warship of the coming war touched water for the first time in a surge of foam and noise, tugs already closing in to catch her before the current could take her. And here's the thing the newsreels never quite tell you. What floated out into the Elbe that afternoon wasn't a battleship. It was a hull, a vast hollow shell of hand-joined steel, riding high and empty in the water because almost nothing had been put inside her yet. She had no engines. She had no guns. She couldn't move a single meter under her own power, couldn't have raised steam, couldn't have fired a shot. The bow the whole world would come to know wasn't even on her. The launch that the crowd came to see, the moment the histories mark as her beginning, was really only the halfway point. Everything that made the Bismarck was still to come, and it would all go in while she floated at a pier. If the machines a warship is built around are what brought you here, stay with her now, because the most extraordinary of hers were still sitting on the Hamburg quayside waiting to be lowered into that empty hull. And putting the heart into a ship like this is exactly the work this channel exists to show. What came next was called fitting out, and it's where the real Bismarck was made. They towed the empty hull to the equipping pier, and over the better part of a year and a half began to fill her. This was the slow, hidden labor that never makes a newsreel, the months in which a floating shell became a fighting ship. Deck by deck, the machinery went in through openings cut in her hull, lowered by the yard's heavy cranes into spaces that had been shaped around it from the start. At the center of all of it was her power. 12 Wagner superheated high-pressure oil-fired boilers were built into her, arranged deep in her belly, each one a furnace designed to boil water into steam and then heat that steam far past its boiling point, driving it to pressures and temperatures that wrung the most work possible out of every drop of oil she burned. This was not a simple thing to build or to run. Superheated high-pressure plant demanded precise, hard-work machinery, and it went in piece by piece, boiler by boiler, into rooms shaped around it before the first plate of the hull was ever laid. That steam drove 3 geared turbines, and those turbines weren't bought in from an outside firm. Blohm Voss built her engines themselves, in the same yard that had welded her hull, so that the ship and the machinery that would carry her were the work of one house. The same hands that had raised the shell now filled it with its heart. Together, that plant was rated at 148,116 shaft horsepower, and on trial it gave more, well over 150,000. It's a number that means little until you set it against what it had to move. This was a ship of more than 50,000 tons at full load, longer than 2.5 football pitches laid end to end, and those 3 turbines were meant to drive all of it through open ocean. When she finally ran her trials, they did exactly that. The Bismarck reached just past 30 knots, roughly 35 miles an hour, a speed that made one of the largest warships ever built by a European navy also one of the faster ones. A hull that size, driven at that pace, was a weapon the British would spend the war unable to simply outrun. And in the same stretch of months, at the same pier, the yard quietly changed her face. The Bismarck was launched with a straight, upright stem, a bow that rose almost vertically out of the water where it met the hull. It was the bow the crowd cheered on 14 February, the bow von Lohenfeld broke the bottle against. It isn't the bow you picture when you picture the Bismarck. Trials of the earlier German warship Gneisenau had shown that the straight stem dug into heavy seas and took water badly across the forward deck, drowning the bow in the kind of weather the ship would have to fight in. So during fitting out the yard, cut the original stem away and grafted on a new one, raked forward and flared, a shape built to lift over an Atlantic swell instead of plunging through it. It's called the Atlantic bow, and it's the single most recognizable line of the most recognizable battleship in history. She wasn't born with it. The silhouette carved into every book cover and every model kit, the profile that says Bismarck at a glance, was fitted to her months after the launch, welded on at a pier while the crowd that had cheered her had long gone home. The ship the world remembers isn't the ship that slid down Slipway 9. She grew into her own famous face after the fact, the way she grew into everything else that made her dangerous, quietly, at the equipping pier, out of sight of the cameras. By the time the fitting out neared its end, the transformation was complete. The hollow shell that had floated out empty was now packed with boilers and turbines and fuel, and the beginnings of her armament, sitting lower and heavier in the water, wearing the raked bow and the clean profile the whole world would soon learn to fear. She looked at last like the Bismarck. Everything the men in the yard had built her to be was finally aboard her, and she was very nearly ready to be handed over to a crew and taken to sea. Which raises the only question that matters about all of it. 4 years of work, a hull welded by hand in the dark, an armored belt hung plate by plate, a power plant built from nothing by the yard that raised her, a new bow grafted on to let her ride the ocean she was made to hunt in. All of that labor, all of that steel and money and risk was poured into one ship for a reason, and the reason, when it finally came, would be spent in a matter of days. On August 24th, 1940, in the same Hamburg water where she had been built, the Bismarck was commissioned into the German Navy. Captain Ernst Lindemann took command and read her into service. And the hull that had been laid down as a keel 4 years earlier finally became a warship of the fleet. Something on the order of 196 million Reichsmarks had gone into her by then. She was the most powerful ship the country had ever put to sea, and the whole of that long and dangerous labor in the yard was at last finished. She would use almost none of it. For months she worked up her crew, learning the ship and her guns and the machinery the yard had built into her belly. Then, on May 19, 1941, she sailed. The operation was called Rheinübung, a sortie out into the Atlantic, and it was the reason she'd been built. Everything the men in Hamburg had raised her for was finally to be spent. It took 5 days to reach the moment the whole ship existed for. On May 24, 1941, the Bismarck met HMS Hood, the most famous warship in the British fleet. The two ships opened fire on each other across open water, and it was over almost before it began. In a matter of minutes, a salvo from the Bismarck found the Hood, and the great British ship blew apart and went down. Of the 1,420 men aboard her, 3 came out of the water alive. Everyone else went down with her. It was the Bismarck's first battle, and it was the high point of her entire existence. It was also the thing that killed her. The loss of the Hood turned the full weight of the Royal Navy onto the ship that had done it. Every vessel Britain could bring to bear was ordered to find the Bismarck and finish her, and over the following days they hunted her down across the Atlantic. On May 27, 1941, 3 days after she had destroyed the Hood, they caught her and sank her. She took most of her crew with her. Of the men aboard, 2,091 died. 110 were pulled from the sea. The most powerful warship the country had ever built was on the bottom of the Atlantic before the end of the month. Set the two ends of it side by side, nearly 4 years to build. From the day she sailed to the day she sank, 9 days. The battle that made her name lasted minutes. The career the whole yard had labored toward was over in a little more than a week, and this is where all of it comes back to the men in the double bottom. Every seam of that ship had been welded by hand. Every plate of her had been fused together in the dark in the fume and the fire of the Slipway, by men doing the most dangerous and least glorious work in the yard for years, so that a hull that size could exist at all. That work was the only reason there was ever a Bismarck to send to sea. And what it bought was gone almost as soon as it sailed. The men who did that work aren't in the story the world tells. The histories remember Lindemann, who commanded her. They remember the admiral who feared her and the granddaughter who named her in the Hood and the number of her dead. They don't remember the welders. The record kept the ship and lost the men. It counted her tonnage and her horsepower and every last Reichsmark she cost, and it never counted the men who made her or learned their names. There's nothing to lay on top of that. No lesson waits at the bottom of the Atlantic to be handed over. Only the plain shape of the thing. The hardest and deadliest work in the yard built a warship that was gone almost as soon as it reached the sea, and the men who paid for her with that work were gone from the record before she ever left the Elbe. That's how the Bismarck was really built. Next time, another hull, another yard, and the same question of what it took to raise it.